You just made me tired. This afternoon, this is the advanced version of this workshop, so it spends less time on the logistics of the process, and we spend a little bit more on some of the best practices. And I want you to be thinking about maybe some situations or some examples that you may have experienced in previous committees, as long as we don't violate the rule on confidentiality. Because I find that a circumstance that a previous committee that you were on might have faced might help somebody here know how to handle something or anticipate something as they come across it this year. So, and the other advantage of this advanced version is that other people that might be on the committee that are brand new to our processes, they may look to you as an expert. So I want you to be completely comfortable with how our process works and kind of the right way to do things. So our agenda for today, we're going to cover these 4 topics, and these are actually mandated by the state in the Title V regulations. So we'll review the federal and state laws, including Title V, which is a type of state regulation. We'll talk about the educational benefits of a diverse workforce. So how do our students benefit if we have a diverse faculty, staff, administrator population that can serve as role models and mentors for our students? We'll talk about and give you some resources to look at the topic of elimination of bias in those hiring decisions. And then the majority of this time will be spent on best practices for serving on what we call a screening and interview committee. We used to call them hiring committees, but we know that final hiring decision is made by the college president, so that's a more accurate descriptor of your role. We'll talk about some of the decisions that your committee needs to make, especially those that have the first closing dates in February. Really don't have very much time to do some of your preliminary work, so we'll review all those things, the decisions that you need to get back to HR. So there are a few things that we're doing different this year that I want to highlight. We were asked both by our EEO Advisory Committee as well as a task force that the Academic Senate set up to update and kind of modernize our diversity questions. So I'm really excited to see maybe different kinds of responses that we get from applicants this year. So we'll go over that. And we've even included that diversity question on the posting itself, along with if there were any supplemental questions that you wanted to ask, because we heard from people who were hired that they didn't know that that question was coming up, and they might have done a better job preparing a better response had they been able to think about it a little bit, especially if they were an applicant that waited till the last minute to apply and the deadline is coming up. You know, they were rushing through that. So we've included it on the posting. There's a handout in your set, I think it's the pink sheet of paper. We did some research and got some information about the graduate schools that graduate a lot of master's degree candidates for applicants of color. And so the research office was able to compile this for us. The first page there, they did some research on some of the disciplines that we will be hiring for this year. So if that's one of your committees, we would ask you to maybe contact, if you know somebody at one of those colleges. My staff is contacting a lot of those schools, trying to find out how we go about posting our jobs with them, and maybe even finding some contacts so that perhaps the deans can develop a relationship with someone at those colleges, kind of develop a pipeline of applicants that can come to us over the years. So that's a longer term effort, but we hope it pays off in terms of helping us get strong and diverse applicant pools. Another thing that we changed this year, we talked about some of the barriers that might prevent applicants from accepting a call for an interview. So it used to be that we would ask the candidates to pay for their trip for the first round interviews, and the college would pay for the second round. Charlie was able to look in the budget, and we're now going to pay up to $500 for all applicants, even for that first round committee interview, if they travel either from out of state or more than 300 miles. We know the people in the northern part of the state might actually travel more miles than someone from Arizona, but so we hope that that will, like I said, reduce and eliminate a barrier that might have prevented some applicants from coming for an interview. And then I know yesterday Luke Lara did a workshop on writing and evaluating interview questions. And it was a time slot in the afternoon yesterday that not a lot of people were able to make it, so he's talked about offering it again. But sort of a focus on cultural competency. And it was really interesting because I think in some ways the kinds of questions that we ask and how we ask them can give us more or less information and insight into that candidate's not only teaching and discipline-specific abilities, but where they are on the spectrum of cultural competency. And so we'll be looking at continuing to improve that part of our process in the future. Last year, the Chancellor's Office produced some data, and this chart is system-wide information. So all 72 community college districts in our system, and data since 2005 on what the diversity of the different employee groups was. So I know this is really hard to see on your copy of the handout, but the blue line on top is the diversity of students in all the community colleges across the state. So you can see that that's really increased pretty dramatically from the mid 50% to almost 70% now. And how does that compare to the diversity of the different employee groups? So the red line that's next is the classified workforce. So again, across the state, that is the most diverse workforce at now just about 50%. The next line, the green one, is administrators, and that's tops out at, it looks like about 38%. And the full-time faculty is the purple line, the next one. And you can see that's been pretty flat over the last decade or so. Now we know that that's the one workforce that probably turns over the least often, and so you don't often have a lot of opportunities, and some of this time period where the budgets were pretty poor and a lot of colleges not hiring full-time faculty. And the least diverse of the employee groups statewide is the associate faculty. And when this chart was produced last year, it actually surprised a lot of people. I know I've talked to colleagues in the Bay Area and some other places where they believed that their associate faculty, their part-time faculty were more diverse than it turns out it is, at least system-wide. So we tried to replicate this chart with MiraCosta's numbers. And so we pulled it out even through current statistics. So the red line on top is our students, not quite as diverse as the entire state, but we're at a 54% diversity. The next group is our classified, and that's 41%. The purple line is the administrators, so it kind of goes up and down, but that's a very small work group, so the addition or subtraction of even one person can look like a big change. The black line there is our full-time faculty. So again, since 2009, gone up a little bit. We're now at 34%, but we've also had a lot of retirements. And I think that that was also the case for some of the statewide numbers. When you think about, let's say, in the 1970s, a lot of affirmative action efforts, a lot of faculty members of color were hired and are at retirement age now. And then our associate faculty has increased quite a bit, probably about 10 percentage points over this time period, and is now, but still under 30%. So when you look at how reflective we are of our student population, and we'll look at some of those numbers in a little bit. We'll continue to focus our efforts in diversifying all of our different employee groups, and that's one of the reasons why. So let's look at an overview of the different federal and state laws, but we look at this in kind of two sides of the same coin. There are certainly laws that would prevent us from discrimination, but there's also laws and other regulations that require us to do things to promote inclusion, and so that very much matches our values anyway. But the first side of that coin, the federal non-discrimination laws, this is a sample of them. We'll talk about three. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination or really any practices about all the different terms and conditions of employment. So it's not just that decision about who to hire, but it would be illegal for us to discriminate on the, who's given sabbaticals, who's given professional development opportunities or promoted on the basis of these characteristics: race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. The age discrimination laws, a lot of people are surprised at how young that age is. 40 is when you're protected against age discrimination. And again, it would be not fair for us to say, for example, we're not going to hire someone because we think they're only going to work a couple of years before retirement. If a candidate mentions something like that, I'm interested in applying at MiraCosta because your salary is higher and I plan to retire. You can't take that into consideration. It may be an indication of their age. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination in all employment practices, so again, not just hiring. So we may have an applicant that requests accommodation. Let's say you have an applicant with a disability in terms of their sight, and they might ask for extra time to do the writing sample part of our activity. So very similar to how we would accommodate a student in a classroom, we could do that for an applicant. And then as far as state laws and regulations, FEHA's, California regulations are a little bit different than the state. You'll see the addition, for example, here of sexual orientation. And so this is the list in California of the legally protected characteristics. And I like the fact that we identify gender identity and gender expression rather than just what someone's biological gender is. So these are all the things, and we'll talk later when we talk about follow-up questions, that if an applicant reveals something about themselves in any one of these regards, it's not something that you're going to be talking about as a committee. And then Title V regulations. I think the wording here is interesting, that it would be unlawful to deny full and equal access in any program or activity, and that the consequences could be financial, so that funding for the college could be withheld if we were to discriminate. And then the flip side of that coin, Title V says to be responsive to the needs of a very diverse student population. We want to eliminate all barriers and be as inclusive as possible as we do our hiring. And then part of the new Title V regulations from 2013, and I think this really embodies what MiraCosta has done, is a institutionalized and ongoing effort to do things to promote inclusion. So when we talk about the educational benefits of a diverse workforce, when we did these presentations on a statewide level last year, we shared the results of a study that was done by Robert Fairley, who's a professor at UC Santa Cruz. And let me find my notes here. He studied Foothill De Anza, so one of our own community colleges up in the Bay Area. And he looked at data on over 30,000 students who had completed over 21,000 classes in a 5-year time period. So it covered from 2002 to 2007. And he focused on courses that had more objective grading and did things to control for different student performance, different types of courses, different instructors. And his questions were, do underrepresented minority students perform better in courses taught by a minority instructor? Specifically, do African American students do better in courses taught by African American instructors? The same for Latino students. And how much of the achievement gap that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of years do those differences make? And his data showed that as much as 20 to 55% of that achievement gap is closed. So we found strong and robust minority interactive effects for all outcomes examined. And he looked not only about a grade in a single class, but persistence overall by students, declaring majors. And so in finding a role model on campus for some of those minority students that he studied, it really had a big effect. So I think when we talk so much about student success these days, it's hard to argue against this being one of the things that occurs, is that our students do better when they can find, as I said, role models and mentors on campus. And then kind of some similar data that came out of the private sector. McKinsey, which is one of the largest consulting firms, looked at data on over 360 public companies across a range of different industries. And the data came from Canada, Latin America, the United Kingdom, and the US. So they would look at metrics like financial results and comparing it to the composition of the top management and boards for those companies. And so this data comes from 2010 to 2013, so a little bit more recent than the other study. So they found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns that outperform their national industry medians, okay? And then if we looked at gender diversity in the management ranks, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have better financial returns. And then when we narrow it down just to the US, they found that for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity at the senior executive team, the earnings before interest and taxes rose by almost 1%, okay? So again, whether it's in higher education or the private sector, diversity does matter in all those outcomes. So the next topic we'll talk about is the elimination of bias in hiring decisions. And I'm going to give you some resources and tools to consider looking at to help in this regard. Have you heard of the Harvard Implicit Bias project? Yes. Okay, I think it's really, really interesting. So this tells you a little bit about the project. They've collected data from millions of people over decades. And the idea is to go online. I know you've been familiar with it, but I'll explain for those that are watching the video. You'll put some basic demographic information about yourself, and then there's a number of different tests that you can take on different topics. It might be on ethnicity, on age, on sexual orientation, on religion. So I'll give an example of a test based on gender. They're going to put up a pairing, some words on the screen, and the pairing initially might be male and careers. And if that's the case, you hit a keystroke with your left hand. And if it's female and family, on the other hand, you'll use a keystroke with the other hand. And so if the word pops up and it's male and careers, and then they'll switch the pairing. So the second time around, it might be female and careers versus men and family. And the computer is measuring how accurate you make those associations and the delay in time in that second pairing. And so a year ago, we had a trainer come here and do some training for us in person. So since we didn't have computers, she was doing it where if it was male and career, the instructions were to clap your hands versus female and family, and you would hit the table. And there was about 50 people in the cafeteria doing this. And so that second time around, it was audible a difference, how long it took people to clap or how accurately they were making those associations. And the idea is that if you become aware that you have something that you had previously been unconscious of, a bias, now you can do something to actively counteract that. So if I do one on religion and I find that I might have a bias, I can do some reading or go to a different house of worship or something like that to become more aware of and familiar with something that I've not had that experience with. So I think it's fascinating studies. The idea is that you might take that test. You don't share it with the other members of your committee. It's just for your own knowledge and understanding, but would really encourage you to do that. They say not to take a whole lot of tests at one time because you do kind of get into a rhythm of those keystrokes, and it may not be as accurate a reflection. But and I was sharing with the group earlier that HR has tracked the diversity of our applicant pools and all the way through to who you select for an interview, and then the finalist, and then the hires. And last year was the first time that we actually saw an increase in the diversity of those that were selected for an interview. In the past, we would always see a drop-off in those diversity percentages as the process moved through each stage. So I'm hoping some of that is that we've become more aware of things that we might be using unfairly to evaluate applicants, or maybe some assumptions that we're making. Because for the most part, at that stage where you're just reading the documents online, you may not know the ethnicity of individuals. So I was always confused about how applicants of color might have been screened out before. Any questions on that? And those of you that have taken it, did you find that it was enlightening? Good. I know some folks have done it and then started using it in their class and recommending that their students take it as well. So certainly if you teach sociology, that may make a whole lot of sense. So let's talk about MiraCosta, some of the other best practices is our last topic. So remember that the college has an EEO plan, and we're going to be putting an update out there pretty soon. And it has a lot of that longitudinal data about the trends at MiraCosta and some of the different initiatives that we've done. So I think that'll be interesting reading for you. But it does require that anyone who serves on one of our committees receives this training in diversity within 12 months of service on a committee. So if it was more than a year ago that you last got this training, that's why you come back for this. So for this workshop, I'd like to kind of look at some of the different terms because there are some differences between what EEO is and diversity and cultural competency. So EEO I like to think of as those non-discriminatory rules, you can't do this or that. Where diversity, our definition is more the fact that it includes the presence and participation of individuals who differ based on some of those different characteristics. Where cultural competency is more about how we work with, among those differences with folks that we work with. And there's a reference there to a book that I recommend that you read about cultural competency. And I think it was earlier today. Did anyone go to the workshops? Or I guess today was a whole conference on cultural competency the DEC was doing. Did they have good attendance?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I was sorry I couldn't come.
Much higher than the keynote speaker.
Okay.
Maybe because it was raining so hard.
That's right. Yeah, that could have been a big difference. So I don't know, were they taping any of it? Standing room? Oh, good. So it's something that's been a real focus for a number of different groups on campus, so I think that's exciting. So the EEO plan talks about our district's goal is to have both a work environment for employees as well as a learning environment for students. that is both welcoming to everyone, that actively fosters diversity, as well as promotes excellence. And as I said, and the Fairley study proved, we believe that that kind of inclusive environment will best prepare us to prepare our students to live in a global society. So in that EEL plan, the college's definition of diversity included this broad inclusion that recognizes that there are those educational benefits from having an employee workforce that is varied by all these things. So this is a list of what I'll refer to later as the legally protected characteristics. We'll talk about this as we talk about when it's permissible to ask a follow-up question and the discussions that you can or can't get into as you consider applicants. So refer back to this slide in a little bit. And then I've also included a link to, last year you might remember that the Board of Trustees adopted what we call the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Statement. So I've printed it all here. And in every one of the postings for the full-time faculty positions, we included a link to this. So we want applicants to know, and we're proud to share that this is our philosophy and our values. And so as we're evaluating the applicants, we're looking for people who match this set of values and our philosophy on this topic. So it'll be easy for all the applicants to find that information about us. And then, as I said, we've changed the diversity question. So here's how it reads now. And this, like I said, was a combined effort by the input from the EEO Advisory Committee and that task force from the Academic Senate. So it states that MiraCosta is an equal opportunity employer with a commitment to diversity. We strive to be a model for equity and inclusion and effectively supporting students from diverse socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds who possess a range of abilities, academic preparation, and life experiences. Please describe what qualifications and/or experiences have prepared you to contribute to the fulfillment of the college's goals for equity and inclusion. So, like I said, I'm real excited to see what kind of different responses we get. The way the question was worded before, we tended to have a lot of applicants that just say, I fit into this category, or I'm a person of color, or I was born here, and that really wasn't what we were asking about. And so I think this will give, like I said, committees a lot different kinds of information to consider. What do you think of it? Like it? Good. It did create a little bit of a challenge, and like I said, we had to delay posting the faculty jobs. And we discovered we had, for example, an administrative search that was ongoing at the time this question was changed. And so they wiped out answers to the previous question. So you might have an applicant, and we're going to be fielding a lot of calls, I think, because people might have filled out the application a while ago, and now they want to apply it to the posting. And it's going to require them to go and answer this new diversity question. So just in case you get questions from people, if they're asked to recertify that application, one of the reasons is that it gives them an opportunity to update any information, you know, that a more recent work experience that they might have, as well as they have to answer this new question. So, like I said, as the committee is evaluating each one of the candidates, I think you want to be looking at, does that candidate understand the demographics of MiraCosta student population? I always laugh when a cover letter is focused on how much they enjoy research and all about their publications, and I wonder if they realize the differences between teaching at a community colleges versus a four-year college. And then you're trying to understand, is that applicant able to respond effectively to some of the differences that we see in our students, whether it's different levels of academic preparation, gender, ethnicity, all those different types of issues. And what evidence do they present that they're culturally competent? So let's look at that diversity. This kind of breaks down that one chart that I showed you earlier. So the current demographics of our full-time faculty ranks are in that first left-hand column. And then we looked at and compared it to the credit student population. The advisory committee has asked, well, why don't we look at the total population? We know that our non-credit student is very, very diverse in that population. That might kind of dilute some of these differences. And so you can see that in some categories we've made, I think, great strides in improving the diversity of our full-time faculty. You might remember back in 2012, we surveyed employees, and for the first time you were able to identify multiple ethnicities. Our students have been able to do that on the application for a long time, but our HRIS system wasn't able to handle multiple ethnicities until more recently. So at that time we had a number of, maybe some of the numbers in the top 3 or 4 lines decreased because those people moved into that multiple ethnicities category. You might remember a few years ago the college achieved a designation as a Hispanic serving institution, and so that's the group that is right now the least reflective of our student population. And so where certainly HR is devoting a lot of additional resources and advertising, but certainly if you have other ideas for the discipline of the committee that you're on about publications or organizations specifically that can reach the diverse populations, we'd love to get your suggestions there. So we've given you some samples. You might remember that every single committee is required to ask at least one question about diversity, and it certainly doesn't have to be limited to just one. But some samples are on the purple handout, and I want to give credit. Portland State University has done a lot of great work in this area, so we've used some of the samples that they've posted on their website. I hesitate a little bit to give you some samples because this really should just be the starting point for a discussion that your committee would have. We really want you to customize that question to be something very focused and specific to the work that the individual that's going to be hired on by your committee is going to be facing. So I don't want you to get lazy and just pick number 5 on the list and not really have that discussion about it, because I think that's really the best opportunity for you to understand something that's really critical in terms of who's the best qualified applicant. And then, like I mentioned, Luke did a workshop yesterday, and I hope he's going to repeat it. Gave us some really good things to think about, how to look for, how to phrase questions, and even the type of questions that we ask that will improve the chances that we'll get information about that candidate's cultural competency. So I'm hoping he's going to repeat that sometime this semester. So as far as some other best practices we want to talk about, certainly confidentiality is really key. And every year almost I hear about discussions that occur in a committee that the content of that is shared with someone who is not on that committee. And I really worry about a committee member being hesitant to really honestly evaluate an applicant if they're afraid that someone outside that committee will hear about that discussion. And it should be more like a jury where you don't talk about anything your committee discusses with anyone now or 5 years from now or ever with someone not on that committee. Be very careful to protect your work. If once you get to the stage where you're reading the applications and you have to leave to go teach a class, make sure you log out of the system, put all your notes, the drafts of the interview questions away in a safe place where, especially if you know that there's an associate faculty member that's physically around, in your building, that they're not seeing any of those documents that, ruin our process. But you may be a member of a larger department, so maybe there's somebody that's a colleague of yours that's not on the committee. They might say to you, well, how many applications did you get? And I think even sharing that number is risky because if it's, let's say it's a small number, people start to think, oh, you already know who you want to hire and this is just kind of a sham of a recruitment. Or they might say, oh, my cousin applied, how did their application look? Well, maybe they're fishing and they don't even know that that person really applied, and if you confirm it, then again, you've just revealed something that should have been confidential. So if someone comes up to you and says, how's the pool look? I always say it looks fine. We got a good pool. Don't say anything else. Blame it on me. Say, Sherry, threaten to take away my firstborn child if I revealed anything. And definitely not sharing anything about how an applicant performed during those interviews, because the stories that you're likely to tell might be someone who made a mistake or flubbed something, and it's just we're going to get sued sometimes. So please, we don't want to have that happen. So a couple other ways, and again, there may be positions that might more easily lend itself to doing a round of phone screening. A few years ago, I think it was one of the computer science disciplines, decided that they wanted to invite fewer candidates so they could spend more time in getting to know them. So they decided to do a round of phone screening. So everybody from the committee was on the phone. They had a few questions that they asked because they felt like they could narrow down the technical skill set of the candidates that were the best match in asking a few simple questions on the phone. I was saying earlier, certainly if you're talking about a counselor search where those communication and interpersonal skills are so important, that it's not going to be easy to do on the phone. So like I said, I might not recommend it for a lot of the positions. Skype interviews are certainly possible. We have an account. So far we've done that pretty much as an accommodation for someone that maybe had a temporary medical situation and their doctor didn't want them to travel. Or again, people coming from the East Coast that said they didn't want to have to cancel their class where they were currently teaching twice. So we can do that. It's completely up to the committee. We've certainly, for classified searches, had a candidate requested it, and the committee said, no, we don't feel comfortable with that. We don't think it would be an equal experience for the candidates that we interview in person. But we'll leave that to your committee to decide. So remember that if you know something about an applicant, what I call prior knowledge, and so you're going to know that when you see that applicant list. And what I've started doing recently is to say that as soon as that list is released to you and you know that there's an applicant that you have worked with before or you have some knowledge about, and maybe you're a little bit uncertain or uncomfortable about sharing that with the rest of the committee, call me ahead of time before you get to that committee discussion. Because certainly I've talked to some people that say in that first discussion about who to invite for an interview, maybe I won't share, especially if it's negative information. I find people sometimes say, well, I'm going to wait and see if all the rest of the group wants to even interview them. But if it now comes out later after you've done the interviews and you're deliberating about who to send forward as a finalist, now if I were to share that I have this concern about the applicants, some committee members might think you're kind of trying to blackball that applicant or you're unfairly advocating for that person. So if you have any concerns about it all, call me ahead of time. So again, my rule is it has to be firsthand and it has to be job related. So what I would ask you to do is you're talking about this applicant as very neutral and even-handed as a manner as you can. Say, here's what my experience is. It could be I've worked with them as a colleague, I've observed them in the classroom, they have great teaching skills, they interact well with our students. Or it might be I've observed them in the classroom and I had some really significant concerns and I don't think they've been addressed. Or I've been the department chair and I've received some student complaints about their teaching or grading. Because I really think that if we know something about an applicant that's job related and it's based on firsthand knowledge, we want to make the best hire. So I don't want to cause you to have to ignore all that information, but we do want to have those controls on it so that it's not a kind of a blackball situation. And I hope that there's some reassurance for you to know that if you have shared some information like that, I've had applicants call me and say, well, Fred on the committee doesn't like me and he made sure I didn't get the job. And my answer is it wasn't up to that one individual. It has to be a decision that's a consensus of the whole committee. So I hope that gives you some reassurance that you're not going to be accused of having done that. So like I said, you can decide at what stage in the process to share it, and it may be that you choose never to share something. It may be that you confidentially call me and it's something that we can address maybe in the reference checking stage or some other manner to check up on something. So remember that there may be multiple people on the committee that have all worked with this one individual, and it's possible you may have opposite opinions about the strength of that applicant, and all points of view are valid. Okay? So again, without violating the rule on confidentiality, has this been an issue that's been a real problem or a sticking point for committees that you've been on? I find that it's fairly common when we do classified recruiting, and I think it's just hard for Miracostans to say no to their colleagues. Someone's applying for a higher paying job or a different kind of position, and they want to encourage that professional growth and development. But if they're really, and I've always said this, we're very fortunate in our faculty recruiting. I don't know, maybe it's because of our salaries or because they've heard we're a great place to work, I hope. But we get a lot of tenured applicants from other colleges, and so sometimes our associate faculty feel like they're almost entitled or should have a leg up because they've quote unquote had their foot in the door. But if they're realistically not competing with the strength of the applicant pool, it may be that we don't hire them. I think we have a good track record in hiring our own associate faculty, but it can put you in an awkward position, so I'm just trying to acknowledge that. And we've certainly had people that have been interviewed multiple times, before they get a job. So, and then the other thing that may be different than what you've done in other places is I do allow follow-up questions to be asked. Primarily, you're going to focus on the scripted interview questions. And another decision that your committee can make is deciding whether or not to allow the candidates to read through the questions for a few minutes before they begin their interviews. Like, were you all hired recently enough that you were able to do that? I'm trying to remember. I think we maybe started doing that about 7 or 8 years ago. I know I didn't get a chance to, so I go into this room and there's about, don't know, 14 or 18 people on the committee all staring at you and you're reading the question as they're reading it to you. You might have been hired around right before we started doing that.
When I had it, it was taped.
Right, you had it in front of you, but
Get to see it.
right. We started doing that, and frankly, I think we get better answers from candidates. They can get a chance to think about the best example that they'll share with the committee. But if you have done that, if the candidates had read the questions, know that they've kind of allocated their time. So it would be unfair to ask a lot of unscripted questions because maybe they know that they can spend a little bit more time with that first couple questions because the last ones might be shorter. So here's some do's and don'ts about follow-up questions. I would want you to ask a follow-up question if you need to probe and get a better idea or clarification about what their skill set is. Maybe they use some terminology from a previous organization and you don't know what that is. You know, we're not going to get sued if you say, tell me what you meant when you said something. But it could also be from something that you've read when you were looking through their packets. So let's say when you were reading their application materials, you noticed that there was a 5-year gap in employment. You would make a note on your screening criteria form, and you're going to have that with you the day of the interviews. And there might be a natural time for you to ask something about it in relationship to something that they just said or a question that was answered. But it may be that there's no natural place to do it, and maybe at the end of the interview you can say, I see that there's a 5-year gap in employment on your application. An applicant might say, well, that's when I went to graduate school, and now there's no question about what they did or, that there's no problem, like they were in jail for 5 years. I'm trying to think of crazy examples. If the applicant's answer is I stayed home to raise my kids, so parental status was one of those legally protected characteristics that I talk about, so you wouldn't ask them any more follow-up questions. It feels kind of awkward, they've just revealed something about that, but you would just go to the next scripted question on the list and not probe any further, okay? So some people are surprised that it doesn't have to necessarily be associated with something that they just said in the interview. It's rare, there may be times where you don't have to ask any follow-up questions, and that's fine. I do think I'll give an example from a classified recruitment. If we're hiring an A&R assistant that's in that front counter and answering questions from students all day, I would want to see how they think on their feet, right? So if you've given them a chance to read through the questions, you don't have that opportunity then. And I'll give you an example from when we hired the HR analyst that Angela Johnson was hired for. We gave the candidates time to read through the questions. We brought them into the room and I said, you're going to have the instructions that they read said they were going to have 45 minutes to answer these questions. So we brought them into the room and we explained, look, we're going to throw a curveball at you because that's what happens every day in HR. Instead of having 45 minutes to read it, you're actually going to have 40 because we're going to have you spend 5 minutes doing a role play. And so we gave them this scenario that your boss's boss asked for you to run a query for some report, and it was very vague in the information. And so the role play was to go in and interview that vice president and get clarification about what he wanted on this report. And it was fascinating. About half of the folks that did that role play didn't even get information like what's the deadline, or they didn't get much more clarification. They'd probably end up running that query multiple times because they really weren't sure what they were asking for. So it was really revealing. And that was a real life scenario of a competency that the person in that job has to do because you get a phone call and suddenly you got this new project that's due immediately and you have to readjust your priorities. So, things like that are possible too, even in the interviews for faculty. Some don'ts about those follow-up questions, and this doesn't happen as much if your committee has allowed them to read through the questions ahead of time. We used to get people, I think, sometimes would just go blank, and so to stall for time, they would ask a question, can you clarify what you mean by this question? And I say it's not possible to interpret it because if you do that, that would be an aid to that one brave candidate that asked for the interpretation. So you just have to let them take their best shot at the way they read it. If you happen to know that applicant, it would not be fair to say, oh, Fred, remember that time we worked on this project together? And then definitely if they have revealed anything about those legally protected characteristics, you don't ask anymore. Because if that person's not hired, they're going to think it's because they revealed something about their age or national origin and you ask more about it. And then, like I said, if you've given the candidates time to read those questions and maybe there's 3 minutes left and they still have 2 questions to go, that might not be fair to throw one more unscripted question at them, okay? Any questions, or again, has that been problematic? I'll give you an example, and I'm going to bend the rule on confidentiality, but it's one of the first times that I've seen it happen where a follow-up question really ended up being a kind of a determining factor. We were hiring for the payroll specialist, and there was an applicant who was working at a K-12 district and had only been at that district for a few months. So the follow-up question is, why are you, looking to leave after just a short amount of time? And kind of to our surprise, the person said, well, they implemented this PeopleSoft system with the county, and I really don't think they're using it very effectively, and so I want to change jobs. We just implemented that same system here. And so that person's evaluation of it and the way they answered that question told us that they might not be happy here either. So, but like I said, I think it's fairly rare that follow-up question is really the critical issue. But I'd rather take that chance, get the information we need, and make the best hire. So like I said, there may not be a need for any follow-up questions, but these are just the few times that you would stay away from an issue. And then most committees I think I've seen will say to the candidates, do you have any questions for us? So a candidate might ask you, what do you like about working at MiraCosta? I say, be honest, but remember that we want you to be a good ambassador for the college. So this is not the time or place for your pet peeve to discuss. And this is my bias, but I know that I like to see a candidate will ask a question that shows me that they have done some research, that they're really invested in and knowledgeable about maybe a current challenge that the college is facing. They might say something about our accreditation status or that initiatives that we're doing in student equity or student success. Because if a candidate says, no, I don't have any questions, I'm kind of wondering how invested in this job are they, But again, that's just kind of my bias. If on the other hand, the candidate wants to know, how much vacation do I get or what's the benefits, I don't want you as a committee member to have to remember all those different rules and policies. So just the chair might do it, but just say, look, HR will be happy to go through that information with you, okay? I had a question the other day in a workshop of what if the candidate's answer is, how did I do in my interview? I've seen that happen. It's kind of smart maybe by the applicant. I would hesitate to say you did a terrible job, certainly. Or another time I've seen an applicant say, what's the one key thing that's most critical to you in hiring for this position? I'd like you to be able to be honest, but if you did, what that might do is give that applicant some assistance if they're sent forward as a finalist. So I would probably in that case just limit it to what's on the job posting. Maybe your desirable qualifications. That's already public information. You're not sharing any other different insight or something. So that's the only time I'd maybe be a little bit less forthcoming about answering that one. Have you seen some really insightful questions be asked by applicants though? I think it happens a lot more. I've been on a lot of administrator searches where there's some really, I think, smart questions that are asked that tells us that they've really done their homework. Faculty, I haven't been on that many committees, so I was curious how often you see that happen. Okay, so here's my list of some pitfalls to avoid. So what I mean by perceptions is guarding against whether a candidate is good or bad based on a first impression or a perception. My favorite one is how firm their handshake is if they go around the room and shake hands. If you're the president of the college and you have to shake hands all the time, that's about the only job that I can think of that even being relevant. Otherwise, I think that's not even an issue that we should consider. But are they dressed too casually or too formally? I think we read way too much into some of those things. Another one that's interesting, and again I hear a lot on the classified searches, is how nervous the applicant is. I think it's natural. You may have interview candidates coming in who have never done a group interview before. I was fortunate I had done that once before, but like I said, with 14 or 18 people on the committee, that's even more intimidating than a regular one-on-one interview is. I would like to see those candidates get over their nerves pretty quick. Our faculty jobs are going to be standing in front of classrooms of students or in the library or counseling and having to get over those nerves very quickly. But be careful about too much emphasis on that, I guess. I stands for innuendos, and I mean don't let a candidate get away with implying that they have some skill. If they use some buzzword and maybe they don't use it appropriately, that could be a really significant red flag that they really don't have that skill set or experience. So again, if they've implied something and you're not convinced, that's a perfect time for a follow-up question to dive a little deeper and get the information. By transference, that means guard against a halo effect. So you see that they graduated from the same college that you did, or you know one of the references. That doesn't automatically mean that they're a good applicant, or there's somebody that you don't like that's listed as a reference. So either a halo or a horns effect could be true. If, on the other hand, you know that that philosophy degree from that program is especially strong, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best applicant just because they went through a good program. And I worry a little bit about that when we have people who've gotten degrees from a for-profit institution. Frankly, there are some of us that might have a bias about that and assume that that's a less strong academic preparation than it might be. So just be careful about that. By facts, I mean check for consistency of facts. So if your committee asked for a teaching philosophy statement and they said all the right things about being very student-centered and equity-minded, and then in their teaching demo, they demonstrate exactly the opposite. That's an important thing where you're kind of calibrating all the different pieces of information that you have on that applicant and making sure that it's consistent and really valid. A stands for attitude, and this is again sort of my bias, but I like to listen for the attitude that a candidate provides about previous employers. Because frankly, if they spend all their time complaining about every previous boss, I wonder how long it'll be before they complain about us as well. So again, that's probably not going to be a deciding factor in our process, but I think it's kind of interesting just to listen to. By lies, I mean, do you know anything that they stated on the application or said in the interview that's absolutely untrue? So this will be an applicant that you know, and I had a phone call last week from a committee member that said, I worked with this person and I know in fact that they didn't do what they wrote on the application. And so we talked about how they might share that with their committee colleagues. And you know, their statement was, I think the applicant just copied and pasted the things from our job announcement and put that down as things that they had done in this previous job. Not very smart to do, but you know, again, only if you know for a fact that that's true, not that it's your guess or you've heard from somebody else that it's not true. And then the second L stands for little lies, and that's if you know that any information has been omitted from the application. So again, you've worked with that person, and maybe you know that they were let go because they were denied tenure at the end of 4 years at a previous college, and they wrote it down to make it look like they'd only worked there for 2 years. And they said they left voluntarily, okay? So that might be, and there would be a time where they've left something off, you might ask a follow-up question. And then the whole committee can gauge the credibility of their answers, not that we're assuming something has happened, okay? And then by shallowness, I mean don't let the candidates get away with responses that are too brief or too politically correct, especially in answer to the diversity question. If you get a sense that that person is saying something that they think we want to hear, probe a little bit deeper to see if that's really their own personal value and experience that they're drawing on, okay? So those are some things that we've seen happen in other committees that I want you to be prepared for. So remember that our hope is that the committee can come to consensus about who to send forward as a finalist. And it very rarely happens that we have a committee that's kind of like a hung jury and they can't come to consensus. Sometimes it may be that someone has a personal agenda. They have a candidate that they really want to see get the position, or they want to make sure somebody doesn't get the job because they have some concerns. What I want to protect against is having some personality conflict or maybe a pre-existing conflict that you might have with a department colleague. I don't want that to interfere with how we're getting through this process and evaluating the applicants. So the EEO rep, I asked to kind of keep an eye out for that. They might come to you and say, look, we're having trouble coming to consensus. You seem to have an issue with this. Help me understand what's going on, and let's make sure it's not about something unrelated to this search, okay? So again, it very rarely happens. But I will also tell you, my advice is don't settle. We know that if this search this year is unsuccessful, it'll be a whole nother year that the load is taught by associate faculty and you don't have another full-time colleague. But I don't want to settle and set someone up for failure because they really don't have the skill set or they're not prepared to teach in the job that we have open. So it is better to have a failed search than to, even letting somebody go in those first couple years is not easy for everyone. And know that if it is a failed search, that department, that position is guaranteed that position in the following year. You don't have to go back through the competition process through academic affairs and the academic senate. So you'll definitely have that position in the following year. And in some cases, we've sort of clarified and changed the content of the job announcement to make it more clear what we were looking for. I know that happened once in the last couple years with a couple of different disciplines that said, look, we need to do a better job of portraying the information in the job announcement so we get the pool of applicants that are best going to be suited to do that work. So we can definitely do that the second time around. And then again, without violating the rules on confidentiality, I'm curious if there's any other challenges that, for committees that you were on in the past that maybe you weren't sure that the way it was handled was appropriate, or maybe a concern that you anticipate happening with this year's search. Any questions that come to mind? For the most part, like I said, I think committees have been able to handle the process and get through things. So if something does come up, though, once your committee starts to have your meetings, definitely give us a call and we'll help you through it. So we talked a little bit about the EEO rep. That's the monitor for, that we're not discriminating and that we're holding to the confidentiality rules. We do insist that they not be somebody who's in the same school as the dean on the committee. So by definition, it means they're going to be what I call a non-discipline expert. So they may not know anything at all about math. And I use an example from a classified search the last time we hired a police officer. It was an interesting committee. I think there were 7 people, but only 3 of them worked in the police department because they wanted to have representatives of each of the campuses and different employee groups. And so both when we were designing the screening criteria and the interview questions, we would ask the 3 that worked in the department, what's the best answer? What would you hope to hear from the best qualified applicants? Because if I didn't know that at the time the interviews were occurring, then in real time I can't evaluate those applicants in the same way that the others on the committee could. And it takes a lot longer, and be patient with them, explain technical terminology. And I know a colleague of mine that's now retired told a story about years ago that she was on a committee for a math instructor. And she said it was really telling in the teaching demos, those who could do the teaching demo and instruct somebody like her who wasn't a mathematician and make it clear to her, that told her that person had the ability to do that in the classroom, and wasn't only going to be able to teach to students that were math majors, yeah.
But does the EEO rep have any say?
Does the EEO rep have any say? That's a great question. Yes, they are a voting member of the committee. There was a time years ago I was told that the members of the EEO advisory committee served as the EEO reps. And at that time, the rule was it was members of the hiring committee who became the tenure review committee for those faculty members. And they didn't want somebody who was not going to be on that tenure review committee to have a vote in the hiring process. But that stopped a long time ago. So yeah, the EEO reps read all the applications, do all the same things that all the other committee members do. They just wear that additional hat of stopping a follow-up question if they think we're going to get sued, or reminding you about confidentiality and discrimination laws. Okay.
I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
The training that I'm going to be in,
okay.
EEO rep, does it expire? Or does
Yeah, okay, so the training for an EEO rep, no, it doesn't expire. If you've been trained before and you're comfortable with that role and you don't need a refresher, you don't have to come back again. I don't even yet have the names of all the EEO reps. They haven't all been selected. Because sometimes it takes a little longer to find somebody from outside your school. And sometimes a chair will call us in HR and say, tell me who's been trained as an EEO rep. And we can do that, but you're not limited to that because they get about a 30-minute additional training. And I haven't even scheduled that yet because, like I said, I don't know who everyone's going to be this year. But they get a little bit extra training. And I really hope that over the course of your career that everyone at the college will have a chance to do that. I find that I listen with a little bit different lens and filter when I'm the EEO rep. And I learn a lot more about different kinds of jobs on campus because, like I said, this will be outside of your own school. You'll get to interact with different people around the campus. So we can train anybody to do that. So it literally can be any faculty member who's not in your same dean school. So I think we've kind of covered what their role is. And I tell you that they are empowered to stop that follow-up question because I don't want you arguing about it if they find it necessary. And it's very unlikely, but I was told a story years ago of this argument that occurred where somebody wanted to ask a follow-up question, and that's permissible. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And that shouldn't be done in front of the applicant because it looks like, we're doing something illegal. So if I'm the EO rep and I feel the need to stop in, I would just ask you to back off at that time. I would say to the candidate, please ignore that follow-up question. We're going to go to the next scripted one on the list. And then I would say if you tried to ask that question and it was stopped, talk to the EO rep in between interviews, maybe find another way that's less likely to be misinterpreted by the candidate as us asking about some legally protected characteristic. So that's the only unique, thing that the EO rep will do that other committee members won't. Okay, so let's just quickly go through a couple of the logistics. So again, people come for training if they have not been trained in the last 12 months. And the composition of the committees is approved both by me, and my requirement is that there be diversity on the committees in terms of both race and gender. And as we talked about earlier, MiraCosta defines a lot more things when we talk about diversity, but those are two things that are visually obvious to an applicant. And I wouldn't want someone to come in and think, oh, I don't have a chance at this job. This committee is all women or all men or all anything. And then Susan Herman, as the Academic Senate President, approves it because the board policy says that there has to be at least 4 faculty members, and it says tenured if possible. So presidents over the last several years, in some cases, have approved an untenured faculty member, especially if it's in a discipline where they may be one of the only other committee members. But we want to make sure that it's not an unfair burden to that person who's going through their own tenure evaluation process to be spending a lot of time in interviews and reading application things. So that's why we try and get tenured if possible. And then remember that the screening criteria and your interview questions have to be submitted and approved by me before we release the pool to you. So if you have one of those early February closing dates, you need to get going really soon. And the other thing is that hopefully with early closing dates is have that meeting, set your interview dates. Because if you wait longer, the dean might have a conflict. I think Mike Fino has 5 recruitments this year, so he's trying to spread his time out. The HR rep might be busy supporting another interview that same day that you wanted to do, even finding a conference room. We've tried to spread them out this year, so hopefully that'll happen naturally. But the sooner you set the interview dates, the better, because we need to make sure that the Equivalency Committee and the Academic Senate can hold meetings to deal with any equivalency candidates before your interviews are done too. So setting that meeting, those interview dates is really critical. And then, like I said, you may want to use the portal to do some additional work. Maybe you can't get through framing all of your interview questions in one meeting. You can do a little bit of back and forth over the portal, but it's really, really important to have at least one face-to-face meeting, especially for those committee members that are not the discipline experts that might need some more help and explanation on some things. So let us know. We can set up in the portal some workspace, or people have done Google Docs or whatever you're comfortable with to finish up your work. The handout on white paper is called the Guide to Our Hiring Processes and Procedures. It's really a condensed version of what used to be in a board policy, but you can almost use it as a checklist, especially if you're the chair of a committee. We have just 2 HR technicians that are trying to support all these committee recruitments this year, and because they're going to be so busy, they may not have time to kind of hold your hand and remind you of things that you need to turn in. So there's kind of a list of the responsibilities of the chair and of the EO rep and all the other committee members. So it's kind of like the Cliff Notes, so take a look at that. We've tried to make it brief and useful. Remember that confidentiality is critical throughout this process. And then, so we set out the closing dates, like I said, to spread out the work both in HR and for the deans. We've anticipated departments that may have large applicant pools where you may need to do the rotational reading. Has everybody ever done that? So let's say you have 100 applications in the pool. Rather than having every single committee member read every one, we do a 2-step process where in the first round, half of the committee reads it. You get back together again as a committee. If there wasn't enough support from that first group, then the second half doesn't have to read that application. It tends to add an extra week to the timeline because you have to have time for that second round of reading. It's just kind of random luck about how many more you might have to read. It's not a hard and fast rule, but 50 or more applications is where we suggest that you consider doing that. For those that have the later timelines, they're already potentially interviewing very close to the end of the semester, so they might say, look, there's 60 or 70 of them, we're just going to all read all of them and not, lengthen that timeline. So we can do anything that you like there. So again, you're going to select your interview dates, screen the pool, narrow it down to who you're going to invite for an interview. And then the reference checking is now being done before the final interview, so I need to change that bullet order. When Sunny got here, she wanted us to do the references before the final interviews were conducted. And it was really, really hard for me to make all those phone calls and trying to get all those reference information on multiple finalists. So we work with a company called Skill Survey. So when HR calls the candidate, invites them for an interview, we give them instructions, and they go out into this website, put the name and email addresses of the references, and then they get an email and complete their reference information, and then Sunny and the others doing the final interviews have a report. So let's say there's 3 finalists, it'll compare their ratings on these things. It's amazing how fast they get it done. When we were looking at this company, they promised that in less than 48 hours they can have this reference reports, and I thought that's impossible, but we've done it in even less than 24 hours in some cases. A lot of it depends on how quickly the reference, if they're looking for that email, so we suggest the candidate might call and tell the person that they're going to get this email and that it's really going to be a help to them if they respond right away. So it's been really good. And then the other thing that Sunny changed is it used to be that the final interviews were done only by the president and vice president. She has also invited the chair of the initial committee and the dean. And the advantage that that has given is that those 2 people have seen them in the first setting and can explain if their performance in this final interview is very different. Because we certainly used to hear conversations where the president would say, well, I've decided to hire candidate A because of X, Y, and Z. And the committee would say, boy, that's not the way they performed when we met with them. And so now those 2 people can kind of, sort of calibrate and see what's different. I've always been fascinated by that. I don't know if people get more nervous when they're interviewing with the college president. It is just a different setting. They tend to not ask, structured interview questions. So it's more of a natural dialogue. And
I've been to one of those interviews, and Sunny is so friendly.
Yeah,
yeah. It's not intimidating.
Okay, that's good.
And it's informal, as you were
right.
saying. So
okay.
It's just a normal conversation.
Yeah, it's really different. And we did a workshop this week for associate faculty members to give them advice on how to get through our process and make sure they're not screened out as being incomplete. And so somebody was sharing her experience that in some ways it was less nerve-wracking, but another way it was more nerve-wracking because it's so much on the line. Now you're one of just a couple of finalists, and the reality of you might get this job is happening. And sometimes I think people tense up a little bit. And then HR will make the offer to the successful candidate, and then I call every one of the other finalists. I like to have that personal notification. At the earlier stage, when HR calls the candidates that are invited for that first round interview, we just change the status in that online system of those who are not invited. So we tell the candidates, we just don't have the manpower to call everybody at that stage, so they just find that out when their status changes in the system. Oops. Okay, so here's the different disciplines that we've posted and the closing dates. We have biology, biomanufacturing, business that's focused on statistics, chemistry. We have 3 different counselors. And when I did the very first workshop last week, we had actually estimated that the veterans counselor would close on March the 7th, but we ended up changing that to the 14th. So if you're on that committee, you might have heard something different initially. The SSSP counselor, last year when we hired those individuals with that categorical funding, they were non-tenure track jobs, and now we've decided that we're going to make that commitment to a tenure track position, so that's why we're recruiting for that again. Then the next bunch there's 2 in the transfer English department, 1 developmental English, librarian, 2 in math, 1 that's focused on basic skills, and then in our health services department, there'll be a full-time mental health counselor. So they'll be coordinating the peer educator program, and then 1 in non-credit English as a second language, and 1 in nursing. So hopefully none of those dates are a surprise to you. And like I said, because of the delay in changing the diversity question on the application, I think there are still 8 of these postings that are not yet up. What we did is on the HR website, we told applicants, in addition to the jobs that are currently posted, here's some others that are coming. And we're just getting through them as quickly as we can, but hopefully by the end of this week, all of them will be in the system. Okay, a couple other things. I would love to have help from at least one member of each one of the committees in Los Angeles. It's just next weekend on Saturday. The hours of the job fair are from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, so I know it's a big time commitment. You can either go yourself and arrive there before that starts. I drive the school van, and we go really early because we have to set up our booth. So if you don't mind leaving at 6 o'clock and you want to ride in the van, let me know. Otherwise, you can go on your own. Last year, I don't know if there was another activity at the same hotel, but parking was really tight. So people arrived kind of at the last minute and had a hard time finding parking. We don't take as many faculty to San Francisco the following weekend. Frankly, there's a lot of applicants that are not able to relocate here, so we don't talk to as many applicants. In Los Angeles, we have a hospitality suite, so those that come, you're upstairs in a quieter place because the main floor of the job fair is extremely loud. There are hundreds of people there. There are 36 colleges that are going to be at this job fair in LA. I think 3 or 4 out of state, and then the rest are all the California community colleges. With the budgets improving, a lot of colleges are hiring. So if you get there early, check in with me, and then I'll tell you where our hospitality suite is. We'll have a copy of your job announcement and the salary schedule and the catalog, other reference information. But I think it's a much nicer experience for the job applicants to be able to talk to somebody that teaches in that department or knows a lot about the position because you're on that committee. I understand, though, there may not be possible for someone from your committee to come, and then I would ask you just to send me a couple talking points. So if somebody comes up to the table and asks us about a job, we can tell them a little bit something else, okay? So that's just next weekend, so as soon as possible, if you can let me know if somebody from your committee can come to LA, that would be great. The college's budget pays for your travel. For those going to San Francisco, you make your own travel arrangements and then get reimbursed from us. Okay, so again, remember that you need to get started on your screening criteria and interview questions. We leave it to you both individually and or as a committee to decide if you want to allow members of the committee to be someone who writes a letter of reference. If your committee has asked for letters of recommendation, I know that some people who have been a department chair or may have evaluated those individuals in the classroom might not feel comfortable writing a letter of recommendation. They feel that might put them in a conflict of interest. But there's no rule about it if you're comfortable doing that. And I would also ask you to consider if the individual teaches in a small department and they've only taught at MiraCosta, if it would be impossible for them to get a letter of recommendation from someone else if you said that no one in the department could write it. So just keep that in mind if you can. And then the out-of-state candidates, it used to be, again, because of the expense issue, that committees would ask us to do the final interviews the very next day after their first committee's interviews so that the candidate could just stay here. What candidates would do was go to their hotel room, frankly, wait for a call from HR to find out if they needed to stay the next day for those final interviews. I don't know that there'll be such a big push on that. Certainly now that the college is paying for those first round trips for the candidates. But if you do that, if you want to have the interviews be right away, we need to know that. Again, set your interview dates. We need to make sure if it's possible. Scheduling those 4 people for the final interviews can be a bit of a challenge on the calendars. And then when HR schedules that first round interview, if that's going to be the case, we make sure we schedule them on the second day or the last day of your first round interviews, so they only have to stay over one night, before those final interviews. But those logistics you guys can work out. If you're going to do a writing sample and a teaching demo, and I think in the time that I've been at the college, I think every search for a faculty member has done that. You need to let us know, let the HR technician that's supporting your committee know whether you want the candidates to write their name on their sample or you want to read them without being biased or influenced by who the individual is. Tell us how much time you're setting aside for that writing sample, because that's necessary for us to build the schedule to know how much time to allow. Some committees want to make sure that that writing sample is done before the interviews. I think that's probably the most common, but it certainly could be afterwards if you wanted to. And then for the teaching demo, you need to give us all the exact instructions, because when we call the candidates to schedule their interviews, we tell them, we read it to them, and we email it to them as well to make sure that they have all those instructions and are clear on it. Tell us how much time to allow for that. And then if it's, I don't know, if it was going to be any special equipment. I know that when we hired a yoga instructor a few years ago, we had to schedule their teaching demo in the boardroom or some room that was large enough to put a few mats down. And The other thing I'll say about the teaching demos, we've started doing it over the last, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years. A few committees wanted to have real MiraCosta students be the subjects that the teaching demos are performed in front of. So instead of the committee members pretending to be students, and everyone that has done that has said that it gives you a much better appreciation and an ability to see because they're interacting with real students. It's a little bit of a challenge logistically for HR, but I know that someone yesterday in a workshop said that they specifically made sure that none of the students that were participants in the demos had taken a class from an associate faculty member who was an applicant because they didn't want them to. And for the most part, committees have not asked those students to provide feedback to them. They just play the role of being a student. And I do a little bit of training for the students. I tell them, look, don't be unnaturally disruptive. But if you have a question, answer it. We really want to know if the information was communicated clearly. But what we'll do, for example, for most of the committees is we would have one candidate do their interview first and then go do their teaching demo. And the next candidate would do their teaching demo first so that those students could stay for a block of time. I know some departments were offering special credit, extra credit for the students if they did that. So I know Dana Smith has been on several committees that have done that. Brad Byram did that for history one year. Robert Fulbright did it for kinesiology. So if you want to talk to somebody that's been on a committee that did that and get their insight into how it was different. But like I said, I've heard really positive things about it. So something else to consider about the teaching demo.
And that would be the choice of the committee?
Yeah, it's up to the committee. Yeah. Yeah. And there may be, depending on what exercise you're going to do, it may or may not. I think the first committee that did it was when we were hiring for the choral instructor. And so that person that's standing in front of a choir all the time, and they really wanted to see how they engaged with students. And so that was the first one that did it. But now we've had a lot of a variety of different disciplines that have done it, and all thought it was a good idea. So a couple other really quick things to remember before we conclude is remember that if you have an associate faculty member in your pool, and they will be identified as such, on the applicant list we mark them. The contract with the Associate Faculty Union says that if they're ranked in the top 10, they're guaranteed to be given an interview. So let's think of like nursing will probably be a very small applicant pool. They might be planning to interview only, they've looked at their list and maybe there's kind of a natural separation. They decide to only interview 6. They have to go through that exercise of going all the way ranking down through number 10. And if the associate faculty member is ranked number 9 or number 10, then they're added to the list of people being interviewed. Okay, does that make sense? So at least rank through 10, even if you're not planning to interview that many people. And then remember that those equivalency candidates, so you might see an applicant in the pool who doesn't have a master's degree in mathematics. It may be that HR made a mistake and missed it, so don't hesitate to call and ask. But the applicant, if they've said, I've applied for equivalency, the committee members need to treat them as if they do meet the minimum quals directly. And the candidates are told that there's no guarantee until it goes all the way through the process and the Board of Trustees has granted that equivalency. But we make sure that at least it's gone through the equivalency committee and the academic senate before those interviews are done. Because we don't want you to interview a candidate and then later we find out that they're denied that application for equivalency. So that's the other reason it's really important for you to set those dates so we can look at how frequently those bodies meet and if they need to schedule a special meeting to get one of their equivalency candidates through. So that can be a challenge, especially towards the end of the spring semester. We've talked about letters of recommendation and who can write them. The candidates can attach them in one of 2 different ways. We recommend that the candidate obtain the letter themselves so that they can attach it and they know it gets in by that application deadline. But sometimes a letter writer will say, well, I want it to be confidential. I don't want to give it to the applicant. So there's a portal system in the people admin system. So the candidate will put in the name and email address of the person. That individual will get an email and can attach it. The applicant can see only that that letter writer has submitted a letter, but they can't read it. And then the same thing if you have an applicant that has all their information in what's called a placement file at a 4-year college. But I will also tell you that we've seen a lot of applicants. Let's say your requirement was for 3 letters of recommendation, and they're nervous that one of those letter writers is going to drop the ball and not get it in. They might hedge their bets and ask 5 people to write a letter. HR just doesn't have the time or the ability to decide which one they wanted to remove. So we will, if there's 5, we will leave them in there. If, on the other hand, the candidate only submits 2, they're going to be screened out as incomplete and you won't see them. So just know that if there's extra letters in there, it's because that person, we get calls all the time from an applicant that says, oh, I asked this person to write a letter, but they're gone on spring break, and can I have an extension? And the answer is no. We have firm application deadlines, and anybody that's incomplete at that time is screened out. So that's how we do that. So any questions? We've sped through this information very quickly, but I want to leave time if you have any questions. Maybe something that happened once before on a committee, or you've heard from someone else that you weren't sure what the right way for it to be handled was, or any issues you anticipate this year?
For the case that you said students were part of the teaching demo, how many students usually take part?
How many students, if you ask them to be in the teaching demo? It's really up to you. I think we've had as few as 6 and as many as 12 or 15 or something. It may be how hard it is to recruit students to do that. So there's no requirement. Like I said, I give them a little bit extra training because I want to make sure. There was one committee that did ask like a 3-question bit of feedback, and I wanted to make sure that they knew about the legally protected characteristics, and they shouldn't comment on someone's age or something like that. But for the most part, they haven't asked the students for that feedback, and I can't remember why that committee thought it was so important. But so there's no number that we have to. It means that we probably schedule one more room because you can't do it in the same room where the committee's interviewing. So like I said, especially if you're at a timeline where there's multiple committees that are operating at the same time, we want to know as far in advance as possible if you want to do that, because we're going to have to find. And it's hard to find classrooms in the middle of the week. That's the other thing. Like I said, I know for kinesiology we ended up using the boardroom, but
Can students share their opinion with the committee?
Well, like I said, can students share their opinion? For most of the committees, we said no. We didn't want to do that. We didn't want to ask because, again, those students might be biased. I was worried about a student that had gotten a grade that they didn't like from somebody who's an applicant, and that's not fair to count them down that way. But at least one, and I was surprised to hear that yesterday. I think it was biology, who made sure that none of the students that were participating in that teaching demo had taken a class from somebody that was an applicant, because by then you're going to know who the applicants are and whether they're internal folks. Now, it may still happen. They may have taken a class at Palomar or San Diego from someone, but so that's just a choice that they made. Yeah. Trying to think of anything else that's been fairly common. The other thing I heard last year, I think that there was one committee I heard deliberating for 4 hours. And I worry a little bit. Maybe there was just a lot of people that they interviewed and it took that long to talk about them. I want to make sure it's not that your positions are dug in and it ends up almost coming to blows. So I say give it the good old college try, but after a couple hours, if you find yourself sort of stuck, my staff always know where to find me and call me, and we'll see if we can work through something that's, sometimes committees will realize what we really wanted to know was X, and maybe we didn't frame the question right. And so if the answers you got from the applicants didn't provide the information you're looking for, I say maybe eliminate their answers to that particular question. It really didn't get what you were looking for. We've talked about the interview summary form, and make sure that that's the consensus of the whole committee. When we first started using that form, there was one chair who was trying to just be a good scribe. And so every positive thing and every potential concern from anybody on the committee was written down. And it ended up making it look like there were a lot of concerns, a lot of negatives, and that wasn't the case. So collectively decide, what the candidate's strengths are, any concerns that you have, or any things that you want them to probe on in the final interviews. And like I said, we can customize the questions on the reference checking if there's something at the last minute you realize you just don't know enough about. So I'll conclude again by saying thank you for spending your time on this, and may you have enough good applicants to read, but not so many that you need an Evelyn Wood speed reading class. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Mm-hmm.